Amen. Well, let's start at Genesis chapter 11 today. We're going to pick it up at Genesis chapter 11. Okay. And let's just read from 1 to 9 and get started here. Genesis 11, 1 to 9. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. Now again, it's so fascinating. The Bible tells us we have a city, a new Jerusalem, that's going to come down out of heaven that has jewels. It has jewels that make up the walls of that city. But yeah, these clowns at the Tower of Babel could only build a tower and had to use slime. And the Bible is speaking to us about this slime because, you know, you've been, I don't know if you've been around ponds much. When I was a kid, I used to play out in the ponds. Back in our day, you know, television only had 2 or 3 channels, so you got bored pretty quick with television. And we had no electronic games to play, so we played outdoors a lot. And so you can play with sand, you can play in the mud, you can play in a mud puddle and stuff. But there's nothing that's quite tenacious as slime. You get around them ponds, buddy. Get around them ponds where there's that green slime and them, you get all them frog eggs and fish eggs and all that mixed in with that mud. But you got something that'll stick to you and won't leave, you know. And if Mama washes it, it might leave a stain. Amen. Yeah. And so they were using the most sticky stuff they could find. Because they're thinking, what if God destroys the world a second time with a flood? Well, we want to ride this baby out. Right. So making it out of fire bricks, see, the whole thing would float. Their theory is, you know, the thing would break off and float. You know, they're not planning on 9/11 explosives bringing the building down one brick at a time, you know. Verse 4, and they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach into heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So notice how the God of the Bible, you're learning real quickly here, especially in the recreation of the world, that it is God who brought division. A very significant point to make here. Because in man's depravity and in his being one in his depravity and having one language, well, they can get together and do too much evil, see? And so while we applaud the abilities we have today to go to our computers and access the brain power of the whole world, and we can learn so much, and we're constantly learning, and it is wonderful to be learning. But at the same time, you can be sure, since now the whole world is of one language and one speech, because you can use that computer even to be translating.
Of course, yeah.
See, it's just going to usher in the devil's kingdom faster.
Yes.
See. Verse 8, so the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Now there's the dead giveaway, verse 9. So when we learned about Peleg, in his days was the earth divided, verse 25 of chapter 10, we see that this was the real thing that divided them. Not a continental drift, not an earthquake, not a meteor from outer space, but yet what caused them, because again, the Bible's telling you right away that the people bunched up right there just west of Mount Ararat. So when everybody came off the mountain and met their wives and cousins and got married and started having babies, they had a tendency all to hang around pretty close together, so that sure enough to this day, just west of Mount Ararat is this big valley called Shinar, and there's where Ron Wyatt found a great till in the middle of the flat area. And when he dug into it, he found exactly what the Bible says. He found fire brick as opposed to regular mortar, and he found this bitumen slime used for mortar because it's so tenacious. It's very similar to what even the ark was pitched with, because as we said, when they dug down into it and found pieces of the wood, it's like it's the bitumen is so tenacious for holding that it's sort of like our asphalt. And that's why even though it's been centuries, it's still there under the ice and still stuck to the wood. So it's quite interesting. Now again, we see the chapter begins with man's attempt to unify mankind. I don't know what it is with mankind that he thinks he's got to be a chief dog, and he's got to be the king, Nat King Cole, I'm the king, Elvis the king, and everybody's got to be a king or something. And make everybody their servants. I don't know where we come up with this idea, amen? But the unifying of mankind, and it ends with God's new provision to unify all in blessing with Abraham's seed. God's emphasis is faith first, and the father of the faithful, and a man believing God. See, that's more important. And so, notice what was it they were sinning? What was it they were doing? What were they sinning with? Did it say they were gambling? Did it say they were dancing? Did it say they were making musical instruments? Nay. It said, and they said one to another. They were using their tongues to talk to each other. They were talking too much. So since they're talking with their tongues and sinning with their tongues, God's going to mess them up with their tongues.
Amen.
And the Bible speaks much of the sin of the tongue, and the Bible speaks against much of the tongue. I was so fascinated to learn this week. Did you know they found that blind people can be made to see by performing an operation that goes through the tongue and into the brain? And suddenly people have been allowed now, and they can start seeing in black and white. And many people that were born blind can now see because they've learned of an operation they performed through going through the tongue and into the brain. And now some people can actually get around because they see everything in gray and black and white. It's just amazing how God made the human body. And while we're finally getting caught up a little bit with God. But they were using their tongue. They were sinning with their tongues, so they'd be punished in the same manner. In verse 7, amen? So God says, let us go down there, confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So their tongue saying one thing and the ears hearing something else, but they had to find somebody that could understand their language. And they said, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. Now again, even this shows again the scientific genius of the people at this time. How were they so stinking smart? Well, of course, because of course they've had all this time. They've had, this lifetime of Adam and Methuselah, they've had this lifetime of hundreds and hundreds of years, over 1,000 years at least, of existence, to where they can all capitalize off of grandpa's knowledge and get on the next man's shoulders, to where they were geniuses. These people were genius. We think we're so smart, and the truth is, to this day, we can't figure out how they built all that stuff.
Right.
Way in the middle of the mountains of Peru, we've got these beautiful rocks that look like something they do in the engravers. You can go by the tombstone place, and man, they can engrave that marble stone, make it look so pretty. They can even put your picture on there now, and the picture stays on that piece of stone. I don't know how they do it, but we're getting pretty smart, but we still ain't smart enough to know how they did that, because these are giant stones. And they're all inlaid. There's no mortar between them, and there's these giant megaliths, they call them. And yet, when you look at all that intricate design, you know that, wow, that's cool. The closest thing we can get to today is we'll pour some concrete, then we stamp it with a design and make it look like it's inlaid. But these are actual giant stones that weigh, a couple cars apiece, and they're all interlaid, and it's just amazing. Because we don't know how they did it. They were so superior to us in knowledge and ability and technical understanding. I've told you about the dark night satellite out there in space, and how at the time of Sputnik we discovered, Earth has a satellite. Of course, we believe with all of our heart it was put out there before the flood. Genesis man put this satellite in space. And how even there was a time there that the ham radio operators they heard the signal coming from it. It was emitting a signal, and there's times that it emits a signal. And so it's fascinating and very similar to that. There is an island off the coast of Malibu, California, and a ham operator who lives right there on the shore picked up a signal. Beep, 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 beep. He picked up the signal on his ham radio, and he got in his Jeep and he drove around. This old man, he learned it in the Navy. He was in the Navy back in the 30s. He went through World War II, so he knows electronics frontwards and backwards. He had a ham radio, and of course he's running around talking on it, and he had one in his Jeep, so he went a couple miles this way, couldn't hear the signal. It was a straight beam, and so he triangulated where the signal's coming from, and it's coming from a place out there in the Pacific Ocean. You could say it's kind of like coming from a rock out there in the Pacific Ocean. He was talking one day to an Indian. There's a bunch of Indians that are known to have lived for hundreds of years up and down the coast there. And this Indian told him about, I remember we used to go out and fish on that rock. Because, of course, there'd be some times that the ocean was down and you could see this big, giant rock. It's sort of dome-shaped. And it has these big pillars going 700, 800 foot down into the bottom of the ocean. It's like perched on a shelf. And yet you may have even seen it because there's a lot of satellite photography of the bottom of the ocean there. And it could be a giant. Some people think it could be just a big giant spacecraft that's sitting there underneath the water. But there's no denying this man picked up a signal that came from that place. Beep, 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 beep. And he's got it recorded too. I heard a recording of it. And it's quite fascinating. And when you see the thing, it is a big giant thing like underneath the ocean there, and underneath it you can see how It's believed that that's where a lot of these UFOs are flying in and out from underneath it. Because you can tell there's some giant caverns, because when you see those giant pillars 700 to 800 feet deep, it's quite impressive just to see what is all this stuff sitting here off the coast of California, Malibu. And why would this guy receive a signal? See. I was talking about Genesis man being smarter than we are. And the fact that this stuff's been around here for centuries. And yet we still don't know nothing about it. Because there is a God, and the Bible is right.
Amen.
And so, they fired up that stone, the brick, so that it would float and not sink.